The way I would have described myself was that I was a very healthy, fit and active person. I lived in the gym, I did martial arts 3 times a week, I ran a 10k most mornings before work. I think like most men, I probably would have defined myself by the career and the job that I had. I remember after a particular training session I had when I noticed I had some mild sciatica in my leg. Over the course of a few weeks, this had become a lot worse. I'd been given some painkillers by my GP, but the pain had degenerated, and I remember almost not being able to move. It was that bad. I remember in the early hours of the day in question, along with the pain, I had developed an altered sensation below my waist. The best way I would describe it, it was like a numbness, a pins and needles type sensation that was prickly to touch. That morning, I remember we called out the out of hours GP, who explained that this numbness that I was feeling was actually a medical emergency, and that an ambulance was coming to collect me straight away. At that point, I didn't truly fully understand why it was a medical emergency. I remember it being a Saturday morning, and it was clear that the hospital was very busy. I remembered waiting around for most of the day until I was transferred to another hospital later that evening, where I was put to bed and I was told that a doctor would come and see me in the morning. During the course of time in both of the hospitals, the altered sensation, the numbness feeling was spreading further down my waist and into both legs. Much later on the following day, and by the time I had an MRI scan and underwent the decompression surgery to the slip disc I had, I could no longer feel the lower half of my body. And that's when I first heard the term Cauda Equina syndrome.
Cauda Equina syndrome is a surgical emergency affecting the spine. The Cauda Equina nerves serve the motor and sensory function that control a patient's legs, their bowel, bladder and sexual function. When Cauda Equina syndrome develops, it produces a characteristic pattern of symptoms, often referred to as red flags. The reason why they're called red flags is to denote the importance, the significance and the urgency with which clinicians have to investigate and treat the condition. If they don't, then patients can be left with profound problems with bowel, bladder, sexual and motor function.
After I came out of hospital, I was left with permanent altered sensations in the lower parts of my body. I could barely feel my legs below the knee, which obviously made it difficult to walk. I was left with the embarrassment of using a walking stick to get around. I had developed an extreme level of back pain, which made it difficult to sit for even the shortest periods of time. Obviously I couldn't drive, therefore I couldn't work. Family life was completely disrupted. I couldn't pick up the children, I couldn't play with the children, and all this placed an extreme burden on my partner.
Cauda Equina syndrome can have a profound impact on patients' lives. It can affect their mobility, in the worst cases leaving patients reliant on a wheelchair to be able to get around or having to use crutches. It can affect their bowel and bladder function, leaving them incontinent, and often with intractable neuropathic pain, causing a great deal of discomfort.
I remember the medical practitioners kept saying that things would improve, but it was clear to me through my own reading and research that things would only improve to a certain point. And it was because of my own reading and research and investigation into Cauda Equina syndrome that I'd become to realise that there may have been delays in my treatment which have contributed to the permanent condition I was now suffering. First and foremost, I wanted some answers. I've myself spent over 20 years working in the legal profession, and I never thought for one moment with my knowledge, experience and contacts within law that I would ever have a problem finding a clinical negligence solicitor. I approached a couple of very large national clinical negligence practices and provided details of my case and my condition. After speaking to them both, I found my own knowledge of Cauda Equina syndrome completely surpassed theirs. One of the firms rejected my concerns that there had been negligence in the delays that I suffered, and the other firm wanted a very large sum of money up front to investigate. It was at that point that I decided not to continue with either of them. But I felt over the course of time and after considerable reading and research into Cauda Equina syndrome and the effects and the challenges and the medical position of having to treat suspected Cauda Equina syndrome as a medical emergency, a name kept on cropping up as a result of Google queries and legal directory research, and that name was Eddie Jones of JMW Solicitors in Manchester.
Often clients who approach us with Cauda Equina syndrome are unsure of what they want to achieve from instructing a solicitor. For many, it's about obtaining answers, it's about understanding how they've been left with the condition that they have. We can help them through that process, but the main role that a solicitor has in acting for a client is to obtain compensation. For many clients with Cauda Equina syndrome, they find that perhaps the home they've lived in for the last 10 years is no longer suitable for them. They can't manage stairs, they can't manage steps, they need alternative accommodation. They find that they can't do the usual activities of daily living that the rest of us take for granted. They need help from a support worker or a carer. They may need a vehicle adapted. They may need money simply to meet the cost of bills. They can no longer go to work or their hours are reduced. Although compensation isn't necessarily the motivation for contacting us, it can make a huge difference to making people's lives far easier if they have the condition.
I think solicitors and the profession, the legal profession as a whole, can have a poor reputation at times, and I for one think it's largely undeserved. The clinical negligence process, I would say, is not a service per se that a solicitor provides. It's a journey that they embark upon with you. And, make no mistake, it can be a long and stressful journey. There are twists and turns, and there are times when you feel that there's no real end in sight. But it is a journey you have to embark upon, not only to put yourself back in the position you once were, but also to make sure it doesn't happen to somebody else either. But when you embark on that journey, you need to have somebody not only with a thorough knowledge and detailed knowledge of your condition, but also somebody who has the humility and expertise to identify and empathise with your situation, which for most are not only the stresses of new physical disabilities and the mental impact of that, but also the resultant reality, which for most is the prospect of complete financial ruin. What I'll say about Eddie Jones is that for me, he was the absolute perfect partner to accompany me on my journey. He absolutely identified as being a father himself with the pressure that I was under of being a father with 3 very young children and not being able to contribute as I normally would. Throughout the journey, there were many a time that I lost confidence. I was afraid and at times probably very difficult to deal with, but Eddie took that all in his stride, and that is probably the biggest testimony that I can give him, in that he's a very good person first and foremost, and a very experienced solicitor second. Eddie Jones correctly identified the merits of my Cauda Equina claim very quickly, where other legal experts failed to do so. Eddie has built a great team of medical and neurological experts who are all leaders in their respective fields, which gives you great confidence as time goes on that you will be successful in your journey. I really don't know where I or my family would be without Eddie Jones and JMW Solicitors, and I would urge anybody to give Eddie a call before you speak to anybody else.